In this video, we're going to talk briefly about some important considerations for translanguaging in bilingual education context specifically. Y como este video es para maestros bilingües, voy a estar presentando un poco en español y un poco en inglés para explicar todo bien y modular un poco de este translenguaje en este video. So I'll be using some English and Spanish as I explain these, since the audience here I know is bilingual teachers. All right, so one important thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about translanguaging in bilingual programs is English hegemony, or a fancy word that refers to the dominance of English in our society. As Louise Moll has said back in 1994, anybody who studied bilingual programs can tell you that there's no keeping English out. If you push English out the door, it comes back in through the window. And it really is true that, we live in a country in the United States where English is the dominant societal language, even if it isn't the official language of the country, since we have no official language, but it certainly is the dominant societal language. And so we can think about English as Swalls refers to it as the T-Rex of the linguistic world, right? And if we don't think about protecting spaces for the minoritized language and for using the minoritized language, we might run into a situation where a translanguaging space might turn into an English-only space. Por esa razón es súper importante que pensamos en cómo podemos proteger espacios para el idioma que no es el inglés, como el inglés es tan fuerte como un dinosaurio de tiranosaurio, Tyrannosaurus Rex, y es un idioma que si no puede entrar en muchos espacios que son para el otro idioma, si no protejamos estos espacios. We know from research that this does happen, right? We know that bilingual students often tend to prefer English, especially in the upper grades. We see sometimes that bilingual students are developing higher levels of English than they are in Spanish. And I've seen in my own research, and others have also found, that when teachers start to make more spaces for translanguaging, sometimes that does end up resulting in more English in spaces that were for the minoritized language. Entonces sabemos con estas investigaciones que sí es importante pensar en cómo podemos crear espacios para proteger el español o portugués o cualquier idioma que es parte del programa que no es el inglés. So what do, right? So we know that translanguaging is this powerful and practice, that it's part of the lived ways in which bilingual people and bilingual children navigate their worlds, and we know that it supports their learning. But on the other hand, we know that opening up spaces for flexible languaging in a bilingual program in which spaces are created really purposefully for English and for the partner language can start to bring more English into spaces that were designated for the minoritized language. So I argue that the solution is that we need to develop a critical translanguaging pedagogy for dual language bilingual contexts. And what I mean by that is, first, tenemos que reconocer que el bilingüismo es dinámico, that bilingualism is dynamic, right? That our students are not becoming double monolinguals. Y tenemos que aprender algo sobre las prácticas lingüísticas de nuestros estudiantes. So learning something about their linguistic repertoires. También tenemos que diseñar espacios que enfoque en un idioma y también que son más flexibles. This idea of both focused and flexible language spaces. So you can have a focused space where you're really working on practicing Spanish and using Spanish and giving students supports so that they can work to be using Spanish, like giving them a sentence frame that they're practicing using so they can stay in the target language. And then have other moments when you're more flexible, like a bilingual turn and talk, like we talked about in the earlier video, where students have a chance to use whatever languaging practices they need to get their ideas out. So really thinking thoughtfully about designing both types of spaces. También es importante que siempre estamos trabajando en elevar el otro idioma que no es el inglés. ¿Y cómo podemos hacer eso? Bueno, hay muchas maneras de elevar un idioma. Podemos siempre escribir español arriba del inglés, por ejemplo, o podemos asegurar que en cualquier espacio donde tenemos el inglés, también tenemos el español, ¿no? O podemos usar español en algunos espacios y no traducirlo, ¿no? Y solo poner inglés, el español. So there's lots of ways to do this. As I was, providing some examples, thinking about, when you walk around the school building, where do you see English and where do you see Spanish or Portuguese or whatever the partner language is? And how can you ensure that in the way that you are using the languages and even physically positioning the languages, that you're elevating the minoritized language? And then finally, continually engaging in critical examination of language use and other power dynamics within the classroom. And this is really important. Thinking about how we can continually look at the way that students are using language and think about how certain classroom practices might be privileging English dominant students. And if so, how do we shift that dynamic so that we are privileging our Spanish dominant students and privileging Spanish, because it's so easy for English to end up as the language of power. So continually engaging in that critical questioning is really important. Espero que estas ideas les ayuden un poco en pensar cómo pueden aplicar translenguaje en una pedagogía para contextos bilingües. And as we move forward, I encourage you to continue to think about the uniqueness of bilingual learning contexts for translanguaging and also the opportunities. You're working in a space where all children are becoming bilingual, so there's so many opportunities for translanguaging. And there's so many ways to think about really purposefully building in these spaces in a way that doesn't allow the T-Rex of English to take over minoritized language spaces, but that does allow for you to affirm and acknowledge dynamic bilingualism and the dynamic bilingualism of your students and create really intentional and meaningful spaces for that kind of dynamic learning.